do a webcast. I have, well, starting my 9th year in July. I cover all kinds of topics, probably every topic they have here and plus. When people ask me for American from the Stolen Election, on and on and on, you know, what's most important, and I'll be doing one on election fraud this afternoon. Before I got involved in webcasting, I was a psychotic environmentalist. I organized 25,000 people in New York for an Earth Day celebration. I've been teaching on the environment for 35 years. Sometimes I feel like it's just repetitious over and over and over and over. What about 30 years ago is now happening. The stuff we try to people out. You know, we tried to save the rainforest, and everybody was trying to save the dolphins, and I was like, well, what about saving the tuna too? Let's not just keep the dolphins in there. With all the topics that I discussed, there are two that make all the other ones unimportant. The first one is the real danger of nuclear winter. If you don't think that's a real danger, you need to read Dr. Caldecott's book on the real nuclear danger, the new Pearl Harbor, which would be nuclear danger, George Bush's military arsenal. The fact that we haven't blown ourselves up by accidental rats chewing through the 24 miles of computer wire that's on every live nuke here and in Russia is a miracle. You saw the earthquake that happened in China. They have more than a dozen radioactive sites. They're trying to tell their people that they're safe from that radiation, but that's what governments always do. So to me, the real threat of nuclear danger is number one, and probably equal to, I won't even say number two, is the topic of today, climate change and the water crisis. The next wars will be fought and are already being fought for water. Millions of people die every day because they don't have access to clean water or any kind of water treatment or sewage. Oil is, of course, the topic of the day, but the bottom line is we can live without oil, we cannot live without water. A lot of people want to postulate on what's the cause of climate change, and is it real, okay? All you have to do is have skin on your body to know that it's real. Something's happening. Whether it's coming from the gods, whether it's coming from this extraordinary activity of the sun. Most scientists have agreed that we're now entering the 6th mass extinction on this planet. Humans have contributed tremendously to the destruction of our own resources that we need to live. We are probably, in a way, the dumbest animal on Earth, because we are busy polluting what we need to live. So it's very important to me, if we don't take care of the planet and we don't stop nuclear proliferation, it's not going to matter any of these other issues we talk about, here, there, or anywhere, because our souls will have nowhere to live. Without this planet, we're doomed. If we don't take care of it, it's just the way it is, and I don't need to be a downer. But this is the most important, to me, the most important workshop of this event. So let me tell you who's here to speak to you. We have Mitchell Cohen. He's going to present the keynote. He's the past editor of Green Politics, which was a national newspaper of the Green Party. We have Byron Farrell. He's a journalist and an activist. We have Tammy Belinsky. She's an environmental defense attorney, good for her, vice chair of Virginia Forest Watch. And we have Susan Livingston. She's with the Department of Peace Campaign. She's a practitioner of nonviolent communication. Her website, propeace.net. So I'm happy to introduce Mitchell Cohen.
Hey, thanks. Welcome. Welcome to distance. I'm also the coordinator of the No Spray Coalition, which formed in New York City against the indiscriminate spraying of pesticides back in 1999 when the city began spraying from helicopters and trucks supposedly for West Nile virus. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that as well to expand the topic. soon as I get some papers sorted out. In the New York Times in 1986, it starts off, there was an article that said, some of the world's most prominent physicists gathered at Columbia University over the weekend to celebrate Professor Lee's 60th birthday and the 30th anniversary of the landmark achievement for which he and Dr. Yang shared the 1957 Nobel Prize in Physics. The implications of that achievement touch the very roots of physics, chemistry, biology, astronomy, and even psychology. Specialists of these and other fields are slowly coming to terms with the unsettling realization that the universe is biased and leans to the left. That's a physics term, but I thought it's appropriate for us here as well. Well, in the last 40 years, fully one half of the world's forests have been cut down. And please think about what that means for a minute. Forest prevents floods, maintains soil health, diffuse hurricanes, detoxify drinking water, they oxygenate the air, and serve as habitats for millions of species. In Argentina and Brazil today, huge swaths of primeval rainforests are being cut down for cattle, for monocropping genetically engineered soybeans for animal feed, and for agrofuels exported to the United States and elsewhere. Agrofuels are being promoted as the answer to reliance on oil and the answer to global warming, when in actuality, the massive tree cut downs to grow these agrofuels are contributing to the very crisis that they're pretending that they're an answer to, as well as forcing people off the land, as well as growing food, fuels for export rather than to feed people. And so we're seeing the relationship of the crisis in global warming, along with the food crisis and the water crises around the world, and the consequent rebellions that have been taking place in the past few months around these issues. In Brazil, the confiscation of land for extracting corporate profits is occurring under trade agreements between Bush and so-called socialist president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. In Indonesia, millions of acres of forest have been burned for cattle grazing. In Mexico, the Lacandona forest, which is home of the Zapatista rebellion, is under siege by international paper companies as much as by federal troops. In the United States, under the Clinton-Gore administration, more trees were clear-cut in the United States under Clinton and Gore than any other administration in recent U.S. history, including this one. So Al Gore doesn't talk about his administration's role in the destruction of the forests. But the most important contributors to global warming and the pending ecocide of this planet are the destruction of the forests, along with the emissions from large-scale power plants, automobiles, factory farming of animals, refrigerators, and paper mills. In fact, you'd never know by watching his film that Gore and Clinton ran this country for 8 years, and they had a potential to do something about what exists, but they were known as the administration from Monsanto. Their policies, as much as those of the Bush regime, helped pave the way, literally, for the crisis we face today. And that crisis, or the overlapping of a number of related crises, affect different areas of the world very unevenly, depending on class as well as geography. And some of this material is from my friend Brian Tokar, who was originally hoping to be here, but he couldn't be here today. So I want to give him props because he's one of the people who first promoted the opposition to genetic engineering in the United States when nobody else was doing that, as well as the issues of global warming and the attempt to reframe what the issues actually are from where the Democrats and Republicans, including Al Gore, are putting it. In a village in Malawi, officials struggled to maintain the functioning of a simple weather station, chronically lacking basic supplies like light bulbs and chart paper. In India, rural villagers struggled to cope with the effects of increasing floods and more erratic monsoons on their already fragile life support systems. Meanwhile, Australia has built a state-of-the-art water desalination plant powered by an array of wind turbines about 100 miles away. And in Holland, they have begun building homes attached to huge columns that allow the actual houses to rise and fall by as much as 18 feet with the ebb and flow of tidal waters. So all over the world, coastal areas are beginning to feel the impact of even small rises in sea levels. In the Pacific Island nations, not only are people less able to live near the shore, but even inland sources of essential drinking water are becoming brackish due to increasing infiltration of the seawater. So there are things that happen that we don't even think about, the implications, and we need to begin thinking holistically about how the one affects the other, and back and forth. Migration of Pacific Islanders to New Zealand has quadrupled as a result of the numbers of island communities that are becoming uninhabitable. And yet, island nations are collectively responsible for far less than 1% of the global greenhouse emissions. So if we're talking about fairness and morality, as we are doing here at this conference, we need to look at who's being impacted most severely by the crises that we're facing. What are the effects of the numerous cases of massive ecologically forced migrations over the last decades? Many of them have already led to violent conflicts. Meanwhile, the two most vulnerable glacial land masses, Greenland and West Antarctica, each hold enough water to raise sea levels by 20 feet, and they are melting. NASA climatologist James Hansen documented a much higher level of ice sheet instability than accounted for even in UN reports. Factors that many of us don't even think about, such as the decreased reflectivity of the Arctic zones due to global warming, the well-known albedo effect, along with an increasing incidence of glacial fractures and quakes, and the lubricating effects of glacial meltwater, all point toward an even faster rate of melting. Hansen stands by his very disturbing prediction of an 80-foot sea level rise, based on extrapolation from the period 3 to 4 million years ago, when global temperatures were last as warm as they will become by the end of the century. And if we fail to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the industrial world, not by the 10 to 15% that Kyoto Treaty calls for, but by 80 to 90 to 95%. And we have to do that quickly. Meanwhile, the world's poorest people are by far the most at risk from an increasingly erratic warming climate. UN reports predict a worldwide decrease in crop productivity if global temperatures rise more than 5 degrees Fahrenheit. But crop yields from rain-fed agriculture could be reduced by half, as soon as 2020. In Africa alone, between 75 and 250 million people will be exposed to increased water stress, as they call it. Agricultural lands in Latin America will be subject to desertification and increased salt content. So the health consequences, we follow a health panel in the same room, the health consequences are perhaps the most stark. Increases in malnutrition and constant disorders, increased deaths, disease, and injury due to heat waves, floods, storms, fires, droughts, the increased burden of diarrheal disease, the increased frequency of cardiorespiratory disease due to higher concentrations of ground-level ozone, and the altered spatial distribution of some infectious disease vectors, including malaria, and the movement of mosquitoes and diseases that used to be contained within an ecosystem, say in the rainforest, to now affecting other areas of the world, which may be what we saw in New York City during the West Nile viral, I call it a fiasco, but the West Nile virus episode. There is little doubt that those with high exposure, high sensitivity, and or low adaptive capacity will bear the greatest burden. So today we are living in the key moment, the tipping point. Around us, the specter of biological devastation and ecological catastrophe is visible everywhere. I feel like I'm one of those people in the old park who used to have the sign, the end is coming, the end is coming. But the misery that will happen as we get to the end is coming, we need to figure out how we can prevent it, and there are ways to organize to do that. It's ravaging the ecosystem, sustaining life. Butterflies, frogs, bees, polar bears, whole familiar species are in sudden danger of being wiped out. Putting the polar bear on the endangered species list, as was done last week, is necessary, but it's meaningless unless we stop and reverse the man-made conditions that are causing the polar ice caps to melt. Just today, I saw the news this morning, the Associated Press reports that the population of desert tortoises in the scrubby Red Cliffs Desert Reserve in Utah has been cut in half in the last 10 years. There are only 1,700 left. And these are creatures who've been around and have maintained the same body shape for over 200 million years. So what happens when bees and butterflies disappear? Aside from simply being beautiful creatures in this fabric of life, bees and butterflies are essential for propagation of flowers, crops, plants of all sorts. An entire species like bees is fundamental to our existence. And you can't just remove a species. It's a thread. You pull on that thread and it unravels the entire fabric. Instead of dealing with the conditions that are creating it and creating this crisis, government and corporate policies are perpetuating it. I want to give a specific set of examples that I'm very familiar with our work around in New York City around the mosquito spray program and the pesticides. In September 1999, New York City began spraying toxic pesticides over the entire city, supposedly to kill mosquitoes said to be transmitting West Nile viral encephalitis. In 1999 and again in 2000, helicopters and spray trucks crisscrossed the entire metropolitan area, blanketing residential neighborhoods as well as swamps, beaches, lands, shopping malls, schools, and parks. I was in Prospect Park, which is a huge park in the center of Brooklyn, on the first day of spraying in September 1999. It was a warm day near the end of summer. Hundreds of people were out in the park. Kids playing baseball and soccer, people lying in the grass reading, making out. Suddenly helicopters, people still have that expression. Suddenly helicopters buzzed below the tree line spraying malathion, which is an organophosphate nerve gas that had been invented by the Nazis in World War II. The mayor of New York City at that time was Rudolph Giuliani, and he ordered it sprayed from helicopters and trucks, poisoning the entire population, wildlife, soil, parks, and waterways, killing bees, butterflies, fish, birds, lobsters, and mosquitoes' natural predators, which are dragonflies, bats, frogs. They sprayed it all over the children in Prospect Park that day, people walking their dogs. Later we learned that people were spraying queens who were eating in outdoor restaurants while they were eating them. Helicopters came down, just covered them. There were some police cars patrolling, but no one was warned to get out of the park or stay off the streets. I ran through the park like a lunatic, trying to get the kids away from the spray, and then I ran out of the park myself as the helicopters. It was a war zone in a way. They sprayed all over the subways, the food markets, sewer systems, schools, care centers, restaurants, and over or near open waterways, poisoning fish and marine life, and wreaking havoc with the delicate ecosystems on which our lives depend. They sprayed up and down 125th Street in Harlem early in the evening when there were thousands of people out on the streets. We took videos, we followed the spray trucks, and we took videos of pregnant women being sprayed there and got it onto the TV news stations. And every station actually ran it, which was very important to get the word out and to begin mobilizing people so that people could see some visible opposition. They sprayed Jewish people in Borough Park as they walked to shul on Yom Kippur, creating panic, memories of the Holocaust, and also massive protests. They sprayed over lakes and rivers, and the horrible neurotoxins drifted into the bay and into the Atlantic Ocean in reckless disregard for the warnings on the labels which said, do not spray over or near waterways. We ended up filing a lawsuit about this based just on donations. We received no grants or anything. And this lawsuit was finally settled last year with major victory in some ways, not totally, but in many ways for the No Spray Coalition, which we formed in if you'd like to know more about this, you go to nospray.org. Well, the mass spraying was orchestrated, and here's where we want to take a leap to see where they're going with this. The mass spraying was orchestrated as a military operation, not as a public health program. It was coordinated not by the Department of Health, which you would think they would be doing, but by the Office of Emergency Management, headed at the time by a man named Jerome Hauer, if you remember that name, and headquartered in Giuliani's bunker on the 23rd floor of World Trade Center number 7. Remember, this was 2 years before 9/11. New York City's Office of Emergency Management became the blueprint for the Federal Department of Homeland Security a few years later. City officials whipped up hysteria to circumvent civil liberties and to manipulate the media. The federal government was, in the beginning, trying to pin the handful of cases of West Nile encephalitis on Saddam Hussein, saying that it was biowarfare. Meanwhile, thousands of people were made sick by the spray. Tens of thousands of fish turned belly up in Clove Lake in Staten Island and in Alley Park in Queens. But no one in authority said anything. Most medical practitioners in New York were cowed into silence, even though they knew better. I personally talked with dozens of doctors and health practitioners in New York over the next couple of years. Almost every one of them was willing to talk, but only off the record. And they made it clear to not quote me. I was writing a number of articles at that time on this. Privately, the officials from the city and the practitioners, even some folks from the Centers for Disease Control, told us that they had no choice but to frame it in terms of bioterrorism, so that they could get funding, even though they knew that bioterrorism had nothing to do with this, and that, but because there was no money in federal public health budgets, it was all in bioterrorism research. So they allowed city and federal officials to argue that Saddam Hussein, even though they knew better, had sent this ailment to us here in New York. Senator Schumer was able to pry loose $16 million from New York City, but only to oppose bioterrorism. So they had to pretend, they said, even though it was all nonsense. And the media ate it up and helped foment a climate of crisis and of panic. Green activists formed ourselves into the No Spray Coalition and proposed all sorts of alternatives to the mass spray. But Mayor Giuliani vilified us. He called us eco-terrorists. I remember that on TV. These young people who were just getting involved for the first time in anything in their lives. He was, you're eco-terrorists. And people, what? It's called a vegan eco-terrorist? And he said, quote, there's absolutely no danger to anyone from the spraying. There are some people, Giuliani said, who are engaged in the business of wanting to frighten people out of their minds. Look at me, Giuliani said in October of '99. I've been sprayed 7 times, and I'm perfectly healthy. A few months later, Mayor Giuliani, Police Chief Safer, and a disproportionately large number of city officials were diagnosed with prostate cancer, which is pretty quick. A number of members of the No Spray Coalition died over the next few years from cancers that were either caused by or exacerbated by the spraying. A few of us snuck onto the lawn outside of Gracie Mansion one night. That's where the mayor was living before he and his wife, Donna Hanover, got divorced in a big public scandal in New York. And we took our own soil samples under the auspices of scientists. We shipped them off to a toxicologist right here in Virginia, Dr. Robert Simon, who has a big lab and a federally recognized laboratory here. The samples showed high levels of pesticide residue from the spraying more than half a year after the initial round of spraying, as did air conditioner filters throughout the city. But the city wouldn't tell people to change their filters. Simple thing, it cost 50 cents. Change your filter next year before turning it on for the next summer. Even though the city officials admitted privately to us that this was very dangerous and people would get inundated with all the residue from the pesticides as soon as they turned on the air conditioners. Officials repeatedly said West Nile virus was a health emergency, although no such emergency was legally declared. which would have required them to prove it scientifically and under the law. All told, that first year, 4 people, that's it, died from what they said was West Nile virus in New York City, and 3 more in the surrounding area. That's a metropolitan area of 20 million people. So 7 people died out of the 20 million that year, that first year. I'd like you to compare those figures, say, to the flu, for instance. Do you know have any idea how many people die in New York City from the flu every year? 1,000. Anybody else?
2.
Yeah, that's right. It's 2,000 people die every year from the flu. What about the astronomical levels of asthma, let alone many other health problems? Heart conditions, chronic fatigue, immune deficiency, or immune disorders that pesticide spraying exacerbates, causing far more deaths than it possibly could prevent. None of these has been called a crisis. None of these has been called a health emergency. So the question then becomes, why West Nile and why now? What was going on? In the following years, we were made to fear one health emergency after another. First it was West Nile, then anthrax, remember? That little item suddenly dropped out of the news when they discovered that the anthrax sent to key officials and media came from the U.S. Army's top-secret biowarfare lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland. Then it was smallpox. There was a whole big effort around smallpox. Then SARS, remember that? Then avian flu. And each time we fell for it. Each time they orchestrated our emotions and panic. And each time, as a result, they were able to sell hundreds of $billions worth of so-called vaccines. And each time they announced a new health scare, they put into place massive surveillance and repressive apparatus under the guise of a health emergency. And they're going to be doing that under the global warming emergency. They're going to be doing that under all sorts of seen as natural emergencies to put in place the type of surveillance and repressive apparatus that we're currently facing. I'll be giving an example in a second. Now they're saying to take Tamiflu as a cure for avian flu, right? Avian flu is a disease that some birds develop as a result of the horrible, horrible conditions of factory farming, particularly of chickens, now in China, but elsewhere as well. Somebody's going to be talking a little bit about that later, so I'll leave that part out of my talk. How many of you heard that, though, to take Tamiflu for avian flu? Okay, so that's the national preparedness that would be. Okay. Well, that's right. You just blew my next line. What they don't say is that Tamiflu does nothing to prevent or heal avian flu. It just doesn't relate to it at all. And what they don't tell us also is who owns the patents. Does anybody want to guess? Okay, perhaps you didn't hear it. Merle said, who owns the patent for Tamiflu? Well, you're right. The patent is held by Gilead Laboratories, which is connected with Searle Pharmaceutical, which is headed by Donald Rumsfeld. Also, does anybody want to guess which company has been bankrolling Giuliani's speaking tour early on in his presidential campaign? That was being bankrolled by Eli Lilly, another giant pharmaceutical company. And who runs this company? Who runs Eli Lilly? Okay. George Bush Sr. was the president of Eli Lilly. Presided over the executive board in the late 70s. The company is controlled by the Quayle family of Indiana. Remember Dan Quayle, who was Bush's vice president. Bush's budget director, Mitch Daniels, was also a Lilly senior executive. Also, we think of Senator Robert Frist, who wrote into the Homeland Security Act specific language limiting by name Eli Lilly and other pharmaceutical companies' liability from lawsuits brought against them from people suffering negative reactions to the vaccinations that they were pushing. Very interesting. Well, after the events of September 11th, 2001, the Office of Homeland Security and other federal agencies began urging cities around the country to spray toxic pesticides over urban populations and ecosystems everywhere. Areas that didn't even have any indication of West Nile virus. They submitted legislation that would require mass inoculation of the citizenry for smallpox. The government agencies assert that this is a means for fighting terrorism, an absurd rationalization for giving away millions of taxpayer dollars to the pesticide industry and giant pharmaceutical industries. Government-orchestrated health scares have also turned out to be an essential component in stripping away our freedoms and establishing a 1984-style surveillance infrastructure in the name of health and fighting bioterrorism. Absurd as the rationalizations are, every urban area was told to spray pesticide on its population and environment, whether the area had experienced a West Nile viral outbreak or not, just as they were ordered 3 years ago to mass inoculate the citizenry for smallpox. The author of that policy, Jerome Howard. Remember, I said that Howard and the Office of Emergency Management in New York City oversaw the entire pesticide spray program for Giuliani. And that was run out of the bunker on the 23rd floor of number 7 World Trade Center. This was the building which, unbeknownst to most of us, also housed a few floors above the largest CIA offices outside of Langley, Virginia. And we didn't even know that in New York, and for most of us. And all of the Securities and Exchange Commission files on Enron and other corporate scandals, which were scheduled to be heard in October of 2001. Though by 2001, Howard had left the Office of Emergency Management and was coordinating security with Kroll Associates for the World Trade Center at the time of the attacks. Although it's not yet been established who gave the deadly orders for people to return to work, everything is under control after the first plane hit that morning. Many investigators believe it came from Howard's office. Howard has long ties to the U.S. military's secret biological warfare development programs. It was Howard who, more than anyone else, persisted in raising the foreign terrorism conjecture for West Nile virus, long after that attempt at public manipulation had been rebuked. Howard was next hired as Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services on September 10th, 2001, one day before September 11th. And together with Tommy Thompson, the Secretary of the agency, it was Howard who was rumored to have told the White House staff and President Bush et al. To begin taking the drug Cipro, made by Bayer, early on September 11, 2001. And it raises some interesting questions. Howard now heads the Federal Office of Public Health Preparedness, created in October 2001, to hammer these mandatory vaccination programs into place. And I'm going to, before I get to this one point about them, I just wanted to let people know that right now, the same forces, the Office of Homeland Security, it turns out, is promoting this mass spraying that they're planning for the Bay Area in California, in which they're going to be doing the same thing to New York starting next month, over spraying this massive amount of pesticide over San Francisco, Berkeley, and Oakland, and the surrounding areas, to supposedly get rid of this total harmless moth, brown moth. And I couldn't figure out why they're doing this, so I wrote to the folks in California, and they wrote back that the moth issue is a trade issue, not a pest issue. So it's called the paper moth or the money moth. Basically, if the moth is reclassified as a minor pest, as opposed to what they're calling it now, this major pest, doing all this spraying, which would be accurate if they reclassified it as a minor pest, the doors would be open wide to foreign imports of certain foods and plants. So the U.S. has a zero tolerance for inbound shipments containing larvae of Class A pests. So big agriculture, very much like big oil, has been enjoying a non-competitive market for about a decade by saying that there's this major pest here, so we can't allow coming in foods that may contain this moth, which is, which is a harmless thing. So once the state was formally notified of a moth existing here, and it's been here for about 50 years, they say, in California, with no damage at all to anything, instead of doing the correct thing and classifying it correctly, the agencies, especially promoted by Homeland Security, have declared an emergency eradication program and are about to spray the entire Bay Area, which also happens to be the most progressive thinking area in the whole state. That may or may not have something to do with it, just as it did in New Orleans in a way. And a huge resistance, though, is being mounted now by a wide coalition of environmental and labor groups. They've even now taking ads. It's an interesting tactic, which nobody has thought of really before. They're putting ads in movie theaters, before every movie to organize against the spraying. And they costed $60,000 for a 1-month campaign in every movie theater. So it might be an effective way of reaching people. We'll see. But as if the Homeland Security Act wasn't bad enough, they've now introduced legislation known as the Model Emergency Health Powers Act, both federally and interstate legislatures around the country. The Emergency Health Powers Act calls for mandatory vaccinations of healthcare workers and first responders. One of the key individuals to be promoting these acts is Jerome Howard. That legislation, and hear what I'm saying now, the legislation is everywhere in the country. It hasn't gone through everywhere yet. It's going in piece by piece, both federally and on the state level, would establish quarantine facilities for those who refuse to take the vaccinations prescribed for them, as well as for those who fall victim to smallpox and other weaponized diseases. So, hear what I'm saying. They're going to put people who come down with whatever the disease of the moment is in these camps, and they're going to put people who refuse to take the vaccines in the same camps, right? Supposedly the diseases are contagious, right? So the plan is to round up vaccine resistors like me and probably you, and put them in the same facility as people who have contracted smallpox. They are basically internment camps for political dissidents, but coming under the aegis of health emergency or natural calamity. If you go to the Centers for Disease Control website, you'll find a footnote about the vaccines for smallpox that they're attempting to mandate. There are 4 different kinds, not just the kind that many of us got in the 50s, which was itself much more dangerous than we were ever told back then. And that's why the California Nurses Association heroically refused to allow themselves or their patients to be vaccinated, thereby igniting a resistance movement that blocked temporarily the government's emergency forced vaccination program for smallpox, and they saved tens of thousands of lives. 3 of the 4 kinds of vaccines are to be genetically engineered and administered to unsuspecting people. This is on the CDC site, but nobody reads the footnotes, I guess. They have never been tested before. Basically, what the CDC is proposing is a massive experiment on an unsuspecting population driven to hysteria by the government and media. Well, all of this being done by corporations and government policies claiming to be in the name of green. And this is the last part of what I'd like to talk about. Green is the N-word today, right? It sort of makes me not want to be a green when I see it on TV everywhere, right away. British Petroleum, or BP, now calls itself Beyond Petroleum. How touching. Next, we'll hear that the new playlands being built on in New Orleans, or what were once wetlands, will advertise themselves as the new green casinos. And no one will remember that the devastation was so horrible in New Orleans and along the Gulf, precisely because the coastal trees and wetlands that would have absorbed much of the water and buffered much of the winds were cut down and developed in the name, of course, of progress. Hey, even my New York City Metro card, which I have here, is the color green for Earth. It's usually blue, but they changed it. It's just everywhere. We call all of this greenwashing, pretending they are helping the environment while actually perpetuating its privatization and thereby its destruction. In fact, a small number of very large agrochemical corporations are, at this very moment, altering the reproductive capacities of entire species in order to extend their control over land and monopolize the world's food and water supply. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And that's what we've been asking here at this conference. All the good things that human beings have achieved, all the natural beauty of the world around us, are being grabbed, privatized, and pillaged by corporate, technological, and political powers. This colonization is legitimized by new enclosure acts similar to those of centuries ago. They're creating a framework in the law that validates and extends the shameless orgy of profiteering and conquest. When was the last time you heard a Democrat or Republican presidential candidate talk about that? Al Gore is part of the most responsible wing of the Democratic Party when it comes to environmental issues. And yet the solutions Gore offers are part of the problem. They add to the problem, even though the questions he raised are legitimate, valid questions. Gore never critiques the system, the global ecological, that's causing the global ecological crisis. At one point in his film, An Inconvenient Truth, he even mourns the negative impact of global warming on U.S. oil pipelines. What it all comes down to for Gore and the Democrats is that we need to shift from fossil fuels to agrofuels. That's their plan. What's their plan? Fossil fuels to agrofuels, tweak existing consumption patterns, and we'll all be okay. Well, I say, no, we won't. Even there, what Gore and Clinton do to improve fuel efficiency in the United States, what do they do? Which is a topic that Gore talks about in the movie without any hint that he once actually been in a position to do something about it. The question that Gore and the other Democrats posed is, who can best manage the transition to genetically engineered agrofuels, to nuclear power plants, to trade in pollution credits, carbon tariffs, liquid coal? The Democrats or the Republicans, and which wing are that? Those are the questions. That's their narrow framework. And we have the opportunity here to reframe the national debate. We must oppose the Gore plan, expose it, don't let people fall for it. We should come out of this conference with our own program, with our own reframed way of looking at this that we could take elsewhere. You know, the media defend the corporations. This is what we're up against. They defend the corporation under the guise of property rights. It's not only the media, it's the Dems, the Republicans, the media. Property rights, what are the lingo? Protected individual freedom, the freedom of entrepreneurial spirit, the freedom that is to exploit and to plunder. And the New York Times, for instance, cuts down, anybody know how many trees it cuts down to print in Sunday paper? Cuts down 60,000 trees a week to print in Sunday paper, most of it being advertised, or a lot of it being advertising. The ideological spin dominates our language and shapes our thoughts. Suddenly, we are distracted from talking of global warming or the extinction of whole species, and instead we're talking about the rights of corporations, as though these artificial entities should have the same rights or any rights as people. The paper and lumber industry's wise use movement, spins the clear-cutting for public consumption and calls it a salvage sale. And they have greenwashing words for everything. Magnificent giant redwoods, the oldest living beings on the planet, are standing inventory. Beautiful mountain vistas are now called view sheds. The last few clumps of trees stretching in a thin line along the highway en route to the mall are there in order to give a false impression of some vast and wild nature on the other side. These are called scenic corridors. These are the words they really use. Carting and strip mine carcasses of trees off the mountain is portrayed as sanitizing a unit. Industry casts the technology required to do all of this in the dubious forge of progress. Why are we allowing them to privatize our once public universities, hospitals, beaches, libraries, prisons, parks, seeds, genetic codes? Private mercenary armies now make up a large percentage of U.S. forces in Iraq and in New Orleans. Rivers are so polluted that drinking water is now sold in plastic bottles. Their source is owned by the world's largest corporations. And yet these enclosures, the enclosure of what had been public domain, received acceptance socially and sanctioned by law. Every bit as much as 200 years ago, the powers that be endorsed the enclosure of lands, used in common, and criminalized peasants, at that time for taking dead wood from the forest for heating and cooking. We can no longer hope that new technologies will develop to deal with the exhaustion of natural and human-made resources as the growing mountains of garbage pass into the waste stream, poisoning the planet, contributing to global warming, contributing to the horrible healthcare situation that we face. The subjugation of nature and of nature within us, and by that I'm thinking of the colonization of the genes through genetic engineering, To the exigencies and production and the market, the exploitation of natural and human resources, the permanent destruction of the environment, all of these, the entire crisis we face today are embedded in capitalist production. The crisis is embedded in the conditions through which the commodities we buy, and thus we also forget not only what we buy as consumers, but the instruments that make those commodities are manufactured. It's not just gasoline burned by cars, but oil used in the production process as well that makes those cars. It's not just steel or aluminum or titanium and iPods. It's the metals or other resources, including oil, that make up the machinery that manufactures all of this. Did you know, by the way, that the iPods are made in China, in the city, in an artificial city now named iPod City? And I found that remarkable. There's a fellow named Roger Salerno, a professor who's written a whole lot on the manufacture of iPods and all the culture around that. We've learned to take all of this for granted. We generally don't think twice about it. We don't even see it, a lot of it, but we have to unlearn it. And we also have to do something about it. But most of us, we've been raised, I've been raised, you've been raised, in these same conditions. We can't even conceive of what it would be like to produce, to satisfy human needs in a way that's not dependent on capitalism and its factory form of production. It's hard to think about what would it be to produce things differently and a wholly different concept. It's hard. To us, even those of us who are anti-empire and anti-capitalist, capitalist production still seems most natural. There's that word again, natural. Its factory form of production is integral to our notion of progress. So I'm here to urge us to break with the capitalist idea of development and progress. The false solutions being put out there by governments, corporations, and their apologists, their greenwashing, need to be challenged at every turn. And right here, we have the opportunity, as few as we may be in this room and at this conference, to take a number of steps to begin making that process happen. I'm just going to read through quickly what some of those steps are, and then we can move to the other speakers. Number one, ban all widespread spraying of pesticides and support the groups in California that are taking direct actions in the coming months to prevent the poisoning of the entire Bay Area with deadly pesticides. Do I hear a second to that motion? Anybody? Okay, cool.
I'm going to reject parliamentary process. I can't second the motion.
You don't have to second it. You can go, all right, you don't have to yell second.
I'll support it.
I can second.
Cool. Number two, oppose genetic engineering, the privatization of the biological cell of natural genetic sequences is the mechanism through which a new fundamental expansion of capitalism is taking place, oiled by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank's neoliberal structural adjustment program. People agree with opposing genetic engineering?
No. Cool. I disagree with privatizing.
Cool.
I don't agree with fighting science, no.
We're talking about privatization, right? 3, challenge the meaning of progress by challenging the capitalist manufactured consensus underlying what we mean by progress, what we mean by development, what we mean by the good life. We need to reject the notion that the good life is based on the mass production and accumulation of commodities and its consequent massive and unregulated consumption of nature. Number 4, oppose scientific reductionism. Think holistically. Take this item, for example, about a malaria outbreak in Borneo in the 1950s. The World Health Organization sprayed DDT to kill mosquitoes, but the DDT also killed parasitic wasps, which were controlling the thatch-eating caterpillars. So as a result, the thatched roofs of many homes fell down, and the DDT poisoned insects were eaten by geckos, which were in turn eaten by cats. The cats perished, which led to the multiplication of rats, and then outbreaks of sylvatic plague and typhus. To put an end to this destructive chain of events, WHO had to parachute 145,000 live cats into the area to control the rats. So the left, which I'm part of, and most of us are part of, like the rest of society, is steeped in the same linear sequential thinking. It finds a problem and then looks for the magic bullet approach for addressing it. Instead, we need to practice holistic thinking. Holistic thinking attempts to look at entire ecosystems as totalities, with their underlying unity as a starting point. In the West, we're accustomed to examining pieces and trying to fit them together in some sort of totality. But a holistic approach, on the other hand, invites us to examine how the whole informs the interaction of the parts. We need to do that with every issue, in my opinion. Number 5, stop fetishizing science and technology. Technology is not some neutral force. It's dripping with the ideology and power relations of the system in which it originated. Too many Marxists, and I consider myself a Marxist, like liberals, over and over again fall for the technological imperative, the attempt to technologize one's way out of the contradictions of existing in a world shaped and controlled by capitalism and patriarchy. In doing so, we end up reproducing the very relations that we're hoping to overcome. Number 6, challenge 6 of 8. Challenge the dominant healthcare practices. Even today, much of the liberal and Marxist left buy into the capitalist formulations of both the official insurance-based healthcare fraud and the opposition to it, which asks for single-payer healthcare, or as I do it, the subsidize the pharmaceutical industry cult. Yes, of course we need free healthcare for all. Who argues among us with that? But we also need to look beyond the narrow economics and promote a different conception of what healthcare should consist of, instead of the factory model of healthcare that we have today. Number 7, unpeel the ecological dimension. We need to actively search for the ecological dimension in every issue and raise ecology as part of that fight. Every issue has an ecological dimension that is fundamental to it, every single one, but it's often hidden. It's our job as revolutionaries to search for that green dimension and unpeel it, reveal it, and organize around it even when it doesn't seem obvious at first. We must make this a fundamental component of every fight. And finally, no to agro-fuels. I assume that there would be other people on the panel getting to the details of agro-fuels more so that we could discuss it. If not, we could ask questions and we'll talk about it some more. So in conclusion, our tasks as revolutionaries is to wrest the analysis and solutions to all of these issues away from those working within a capitalist paradigm, such as Al Gore and most others that are given airtime. I think that in the next session on revolution and in all the other sections at this conference, we'll begin to discuss just how to do that. We have an amazing opportunity in front of us to reframe the issues and the way people think about them. More and more people are mobilizing today on these issues, the food and water rebellions that I mentioned earlier that have been taking place all over the world. But the entire apparatus of global capitalism is mobilizing as well to divert us, to trick us, and when necessary, to smash us down, to jail us, to murder us. They'll make it seem that their actions are reasonable and that the solutions are effective and that we are the lunatics. We are the Luddites, as if that's a bad term anyway. We are the conspiracy theorists. We are even the terrorists. Well, I am a terrorist, T-E-R-R-A. I'm part of an international terrorist conspiracy, Terror is Earth, whose goal is to overthrow the capitalist system to save the Earth. And I ask who will stand here with me. Thanks.
Okay, I know a lot of you are watching the clock. I'm watching it too. No worries, we have time for everyone to get to speak. A couple of things I wanted to say. Great speech, Mitchell. I want to copy that. Jerome Hauer, who Mitchell mentioned several times in his lecture, is a key player in 9/11. Kroll Associates is a private security firm that sells security and surveillance to the United States. Richard Grove broke that story wide open. So please check Richard's site, 8thestate.com, or get to my website and Google Richard Grove on it. Al Gore's A Convenient Truth. It was convenient for Al Gore to make himself a hero after years on the on Clinton's administration doing nothing for the environment. Maybe he found his soul again, I don't know. But I do know that there are two fabulous Italian producers, Maria Vaz and Giovanni De Bello, who produced a movie that's out of this world with solutions. It's called A Convenient Truth, Urban Solutions from Curitiba, Brazil. Brazil with no money made Curitiba a perfect example of environmental sustainability. I highly recommend it. It's a happy film. We all know what the problems are. There are people out there working on solutions, and as I said, the people with the solutions are the ones that come on my show, so it's not all doom and gloom. There are plenty of things we can do to stop this. I agree with what Mitchell said about the spray programs. The spray program in California is supposed to last 3 years with an untested pesticide. What annoys me most is the chemtrails they spray over the entire country every day. The government won't even acknowledge the chemtrails. I have a huge section with chemtrail experts on my show. So if they're worried about secondhand smoke, I want to know what they're doing about the chemtrails. So everybody get your neighbors to look up. Once people actually look up and you say, what are those lines in the sky? Their life is never the same again. Jeremiah Wright seemed to be good enough for Obama Hussein until Jeremiah Wright started telling the truth. Okay. Jeremiah Wright quotes Dr. Lenny Horowitz's work. I have tons of interviews with Lenny Horowitz about West Nile, SARS, and all the other bioweapons that they test first on Americans. It may sound crazy to you. You're going to have to do the homework. Dr. Leonard Horowitz is one of his best books, Death in the Air. And of course, don't give up until it's over. You know, they say wake up and smell the roses, or, you know, don't forget to stop and smell the flowers. Well, that could be part of why the bees are dying, because the flowers are not giving off scent because of all our pollution. So if they can't smell their food, they're not going to find their food. And that could be one of the reasons the bees are going away. Chief Seattle said it best many years ago. He said, without the animals, man would die of a lonely spirit. And I truly believe that we're at that point. What can you do immediately? You can stop listening to people who are going to tell you if you vote for a Green Party candidate, you are going to be a spoiler vote for one of the one world order big corporation who's wearing the suit, Patsy. There is a solution here today. His name is Jesse Johnson. He's running for president on the green ticket. If not now, when? And if not us, who? There is no such thing as a spoiler ticket. Most Americans don't vote because they don't like the options, okay? There's no way, if you vote independent or vote green, it's spoiling anything for anybody except the international banksters that puppeteer both the Democrat and Republican candidate. And until we speak as one, nothing will change. So I'm very happy to introduce Jesse Johnson, boots and all.
Well, thank you. And I'm hoping that I'm finally in the right place. This is on climate change and the water crisis. And my apologies for being late because I was over in 007 and I called Garda and she said, well, try 33. And so I've been all over campus, but I didn't get the insert. Wow. Mitchell, you brought up so many points there, and running for president, I tend to want to address nearly all of them, but I can't. Time will not permit. So what I really want to talk to you about is my particular homeboy area of expertise, which has to do with the climate crisis and our water shortage. And I've been honored and blessed to have the opportunity to run for president and travel around the country and sharing the absolute devastation that we experience in Appalachia, and particularly in West Virginia, to produce this artificial light, sound that you're getting to experience.